Yes, I've been asked to talk about Articles 290 and 291 of the Lisbon Treaty. And I should say perhaps first that my role in the Parliament is as Deputy Secretary General of the Socialist Group, so my perspective on all of this is not as a specialist or a practitioner, but perhaps as a close political observer. And as you've heard, these articles in the treaty are the successors to this thing called comitology, which is notoriously one of the most obscure, most complex, most boring, most impenetrable topics to be found even in Brussels. So it's perfect for this end of the afternoon graveyard slot. But what I want to focus on is not the technical detail, but the bigger issues of power and democracy, because I think they're a little more interesting. In the time available, that means, I think, focusing largely on the boundaries between Article 290 and 291. Now, why do I say that? I say that because democratically, and especially from the viewpoint of the European Parliament, Articles 290 and 291 are like chalk and cheese. As you've heard, Article 290 sets out very detailed, transparent provisions by which the EU legislator can delegate power to the Commission and can revoke that delegation. And the revolutionary element in all this, in EU terms, is that in every aspect of delegation of powers under Article 290, the Commission and the Council and the Parliament are for the first time on a 100% equal footing. Now, this is potentially a huge step forward in the democratic accountability of the European project, because before the Lisbon Treaty, all decisions below the legislative level, whether they were implementing, supplementing, amending, or updating legislation, all of them were the province of this thing called comitology. And that meant in practice that enormously significant decisions on running the single market, on the allocation of development aid, on the regulations governing the spending of taxpayers' money, many such decisions fell inevitably to small, secretive committees of European and national civil servants. All of them lovely people, but these are precisely the people and the committees that the tabloid newspapers are talking about when they rant against the power of unelected Brussels bureaucrats. And for once, the tabloids are right. Such committees should not be taking political decisions without public scrutiny and democratic control. And so that's why in the Lisbon Treaty we have Article 290. But no sooner was the ink dry on the Lisbon Treaty than war broke out between the Parliament and the Council over what Articles 290 and 291 actually mean. Because with Article 291 we're still in the world of discrete little committees of civil servants, which shouldn't matter because the treaty says 291 implementing powers, and implementation of the laws is classically a matter for the executive. So all power to them, let them get on with it. The European Parliament has almost no say in Article 291, and nor should it. Implementation is not our job. But there's the rub. Where is the dividing line between implementing powers and quasi-legislative powers? Now, if you read the treaty with a lawyer's eye, it does give some clues, but it leaves, as both previous speakers have said, a lot of room for argument. So what's happened in practice? Well, despite a lot of mutual hostility over the issue, since December 2009, Parliament and the Council have managed to reach agreement on non-controversial use of Article 290 in quite a number of legislative acts. Unfortunately, I can't give you a score sheet of who won or lost what ground on all the legislative dossiers that have passed through the Parliament since then. I can't tell you whether the apparent scope of Article 290 has been expanded or shrunk by the case law that has developed since 2009. We're still working on getting a list and a full analysis of that sort, but in the time left I wanted to look at two examples of where things have come unstuck between the institutions, because those give you a flavour, I think, of the positions of each institution and of what's at stake. First, and briefly, a draft regulation updating EU legislation on the marketing, labelling and so forth of what are called novel foods. That's those which include nanomaterials, genetically modified organisms and so forth. Negotiations broke down on this legislation last March, and it's now on ice, partly because the European Parliament insisted that amending the annex to the regulation in order to add new and additional novel foods that might be invented or developed in the future, that such an amendment should be the subject of a delegated act. The Council said, no, this is pure implementation, it's Article 291, and the Parliament can keep its nose out. Well, I invite you to judge for yourselves. The debate was about amendment, keyword, of an annex, therefore non-essential elements, to add additional novel foods. So you tell me, does that amend or supplement the legislation, Article 290, or is it pure implementation? Well, you might think with me that it's open and shut, unless you've come here from the Council, in which case you probably don't. That's one example, but the biggest conflict so far between Parliament and the Council on the use of delegated acts has concerned the financial instruments which finance the EU's external actions. Things like the Development Cooperation Instrument, the Pre-Accession Instrument, and so on. On these issues, the Commission and Council are both opposed in principle to using delegated acts on matters of financial programming. There's been a prolonged deadlock over this because over measures to update the regulations for this financing, which have been particularly fierce because it's seen as a test case. From 2013 onwards, there will be new regulations in all of this area, which will probably spend about 70 billion euros of taxpayers' money. So this is a big issue. It's a very complex package. I've neither the time 13 with one was inevitably much more general than the legislation that had preceded it. And so it potentially left much more discretion, much more room for political judgment at a sub-legislative level. And to do that, it created three levels of decision-making. First, the legislation itself, which establishes an exhaustive shopping list of actions which potentially could be funded by development funds. Second level, programming. Country strategy papers, regional strategy papers, thematic strategy papers, and this is where the real political choices are made. These are the papers that decide on the allocation of money between countries, between regions, between themes, which identifies the priority sectors for development spending and decides how much money should be spent on them. Third level is implementation. That's annual action programs. The view of the Parliament is that the second level, the programming level, must be the subject of Article 290. It must be the subject of delegated act. Why? Because it's highly political. The regulation, for example, says that 5.2 billion euros of development money should be spent in Asia. But should Afghanistan get 600 million of that, or 60 million, or 6 million? And what split of funds between Afghanistan and Pakistan best meets the EU's development objectives or its strategic objectives, it's political. The Council says, no, we must never, ever let the European Parliament get their hands on financial programming, especially in external actions where EP legislative powers are weak. The implications are huge, because the Council's nightmare is that if the Parliament gets a real say in the use of external action money, it will be a foot in the door, leading to increased Parliament influence on external policies. We'll know at the end of this month whether and how the deadlock has been broken. A deal will be put to plenary in Brussels, whose solution is to kick the can down the road. The key elements are, just like in economic governance, instead of choosing Article 290, our choice, or Article 291, the Council's choice, there will be detailed figures and detailed guidelines on how to exercise discretion, all written into the basic legislation. And there will be a declaration from the Commission that in future, after 2013, it will make use of Article 290, although exactly what kind of use they'll make and whether it will come anywhere near the Parliament's demands is completely shrouded in mystery. Now, this kind of solution, putting everything into the Basic Act, goes completely against the purpose of Articles 290 and 291, and the deadlock we see over development financing and a number of other dossiers is causing serious delays in the adoption of legislation. Teething troubles, and I'm finishing now, teething troubles perhaps shouldn't surprise us. Articles 290 and 291 represent a major shift in the EU's way of doing things, and potentially a big shift in power between institutions. When the stakes are high, and the wording of the treaty is unclear, as I believe it is, my view is that sooner or later we're going to see this in the European Court of Justice and let them sort out the mess. Thank you.